Hello, sisters, and welcome to Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. It's time to sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy my conversation with Alicia Rasley as she shares about her time in England researching for her fiction novels.
Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean go solo live? Have you ever been asked why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Joining me today is award-winning author Alicia Rasley. Welcome, Alicia.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I threw in award-winning author because I believe after looking at your website a bit, you have some humility around that. And I want to make sure that people understand that even award-winning authors travel solo.
Well, yeah, in fact, that's one of the good things about being an author is you have sort of an excuse to travel solo, and no one blinks an eye when you say, oh, I've got to go do my research.
Oh, and that's awesome because your travel is related directly to the work that you're doing. So I love to say, yes, I have to go for work.
Yes, and it's deductible then too.
Well, right. Financially, that's a good thing. But it seems to give a whole different level of credibility or validity to the situation. And I'm like, but I would still go alone if it were just for fun.
Well, I have done that. I just don't necessarily want the IRS to know it.
True statement. I'm with you on that. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I would love to talk about, before we get into how solo travel specifically relates to the work that you do, I would like to hear a little bit about how was travel part of your life growing up?
I come from a big family. I've got 7 siblings, and my father was a college professor. And back then, I'm a college professor now, and I don't get summers off, but back then, he got every summer off. And so he'd pack us all in. My mom would pack us in the car with the dog and the cat and drive across the country. And so this was time after time. And, I marvel. I only had 2 children, and I just marvel at their patience looking back on that. And so we traveled as a family. We camped all the way out to California and the Northwest. And my grandparents, who were just like that, took us all to Alaska once, and we camped all the way to Alaska. And but if my parents couldn't drive there, they wouldn't go. And so I never left the continent until I was grown up. And
yet you guys drove to Alaska?
My grandparents, yes, we had a Dodge van, which when I got married, my parents gave us that van with 150,000 miles on it. It lasted about another year. We drove all the way up, 7 kids, and then at that point, and then my aunt and my grandparents all went, and it was an amazing trip. It was probably 15,000 miles, 20,000 miles. And all together, because we went all the way around Canada, too. I know, I come from intrepid stock, but I didn't want to do that anymore. The last thing I ever want to do is camp now.
And what about road trips? Do you also have an aversion to road trips?
My husband and I have a son who lives out in Los Angeles. We live in Indiana. And so we've been driving out there every winter to see him. And we drive very much the way my parents drove. So on I-40 going through New Mexico. And so we take that basically the same trip that they would take us on when I was a kid. So, but I now, because of that, when you travel with, sometimes my grandmother would come too after my grandfather died, and would be packed into this international travel haul or this Dodge van or something like that. And it would just be like a bunch of sardines in a tin can. And so you can understand why traveling solo has such appeal to me, because we traveled in this group that was, as big as a basketball team, really. And
absolutely.
Yes, and I only have one sister, so generally we got a tent to ourselves. Except there was always a baby. I'm one of the older ones, and there was always a baby, and we'd have to have the baby in with us, so it's just a great thing. Having a hotel room to myself is just such a blessing. So.
So I mean, that's all part of it, though. Like you have these experiences growing up that shape the way you think about some of those things. And then as an adult, you have the option to do things like that, like road tripping out to see your son,
Hmm.
or to do things not like that, like staying on your own in your hotel room.
Yes, and one thing is, I am an American and love road trips. So even when I go to Europe, I want to have a car, and I know that's just like the ugly American. There we are contributing to the carbon footprint problem and all that, but I need a car. So.
That's pretty cool. Actually, I don't really have a lot of interest in driving in another country.
Well, I have to say I'm not a very good packer, and with a car you can always put that suitcase in the trunk, and you don't have to try to heft it up onto the train. The last trip I took to England, I did both. I trained, but I rented a car for about 3 days.
I
So.
love it. Well, and again, part of this is knowing yourself, knowing what works for you, and then making choices accordingly.
Hmm.
I love it. Well, so you had these Midwest American adventures, those road trips growing
Yeah,
up, and you said 7 siblings, only one sister.
I have 6 brothers and a sister.
Okay. So did everybody land in the Midwest or did they scatter?
Well, we ended up in Virginia. My father taught at Virginia Tech, and so they mostly ended up in the Richmond area. And I went to the University of Chicago, where I met my husband, who was a Hoosier, and so I ended up back. No kidding, about 3 miles from where my father grew up, and so big world travel here. I end up back in not very far from where my dad's from. But so I married a Hoosier. So, Hoosier born and Hoosier bred. And when he dies, he'll be Hoosier dead.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, and it's funny because I've done a couple of interviews today and there's many people who have been, Midwesterners by birth. So it's always fun to see that perspective. And it's something that I should be looking at people from all over the US because there is different perspective, if you've grown up on the coasts and things like
Hmm.
that.
Yes, it's good being in the middle of the country, because then you can go either way very easily. It's the from here driving to Los Angeles is 2.5 days if you drive all the way through, where it's 4 days if you drive from the east. So it's still a trek. It's still a long way, and we don't do it in 2.5 days. Uh, but it's here. The other thing is when you're in Indiana, everything's flat. Everything's sort of featureless. I mean, you get to kind of know the landscape, but so going somewhere else is a real treat.
Absolutely. That makes complete sense. So, which came first, your writing about England or your travel to England? How did that all come about?
I'm trying to remember. After I got married, my husband is much more of a world traveler than I am, and we went to England. And for a couple of weeks, my brother was stationed. One of my brothers was stationed at Mildenhall, which is near Bury St. Edmunds, so up in the Suffolk area. And so we went up to visit him. And so even then, wanted to drive and all that. And my husband wanted to go on to Greece, but I was so in love with England that I stayed. And so I traveled around England by myself, and I was 19 years old. And I had never been out of the country. And so that, I think even then, I really enjoyed being on my own. And back then, of course, I was poor. And so I'd be hosteling all the way and
You bet.
meeting other girls and, in some town and saying, can we all get a room together tonight so that we can share expenses. So I was much more I don't want to say desperate, but back then you made do when you're poor and you're traveling, and you're young especially, you make do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you can give up some of the luxuries in order
Hmm.
for the experiences.
And I am not a high maintenance person. If I don't have to camp and there's a working toilet around, I'm happy. This is luxury to me after, all those 15 years of camping all over the country. So, that's, I don't require a lot of luxury now. That so after that summer in England, I loved it so much I decided I wanted to write about it. And there is a genre of novels which are sort of Jane Austen style novels, Regency romances. They're kind of social comedies, and they're set usually somewhere around London and in the Napoleonic era, so 1800 to 1830.
What attracted you to that line of writing?
Well, I was an English major, and I'd read Jane Austen. The language can be really good. There was a very strong desire for wit, and so I guess when I started writing, I thought I was pretty witty. I don't know if I am, but so I thought that this way I could, go ahead and give in to my romance uh, needs, because have always been a romantic, but also with this sort of edge of cynicism and wit that comes from writing in the Regency period, which is the time of Jane Austen. And of course, she wrote romances, but they were very unromantic romances, which is kind of what I tend to like. I like, love conquers all. However, it's not hearts and flowers.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. So, when you go to England and you're looking for inspiration,
Hmm.
you know, tell me what that adventure is like.
Well, this is one thing that really you have to do alone as a solo traveler, because very few other people are going to tromp around, and because there's going to be an owl in your next book, you have to go to the owlry, or you know so you have one character who does salmon fishing, so you have to go to a salmon fishery and learn how to do fish. So very few people would go along with this. I mean, no one has the same obsessions, and so for so it's great to do this alone, because you're not tied by any means to anyone else's inclinations or needs or desires. Basically, I do what I want. What I try to do, though, I'm really a planner. I plan the whole trip out very carefully. I study very carefully. I'm a researcher, though. Find out what I need to research before I research it. I'm not someone who reads a dozen books and then writes a book based on that. I write a book until I'm thinking, I don't know how they make pencils.
Ah,
Why? I really need to find out how pencils were made. And so I jot down, I need to go find how pencils were made. And believe it or not, there's a pencil museum in England. There's a museum for everything in Great Britain. And so I went to the pencil museum and found out all about pencils. And so I write until I know I need to learn something, and then I write it down and go off to learn that. There's certain things, of course, now with Google, you can find out almost anything, but you can't get the actual feel of the place.
sure.
And England's great because some of these villages, they've got cars, but other than that, they are pretty much the way they were in 1830. And so you can go there and soak it up. What does the sunlight look like bouncing off, the Cotswold stone in the Cotswolds, or what is it? How does the English Channel look different than an ocean does? And what does it smell like? And things like that. All these things that can go into the book, but you can't get from, even if you were pen pals with someone in England, they wouldn't have the same experience that sort of or be able to convey that. They're not the writer, I'm the writer.
Absolutely. That perfect. And you're writing to an audience that is likely following you. And so to have that consistent voice of description only you can get that from experiencing it yourself.
I think also one of the things when you write historical fiction, everybody knows this didn't happen and that if it did happen, it happened a long time ago. And what they really want is to be able to immerse themselves in the experience. And so you have to be as authentic as possible. And readers love to know that I was in this place and here are some pictures of the place I was at. And, this is based on my own experience. And um, so that's been a way really to meet readers in a way that they are excited about the idea. Many of them can't travel, especially a lot of romance readers are younger women and they have children and they're not in a position that they can travel to England, so they read about it and they have Pinterest pictures. And so to have someone, a writer that they know went on this trip, went to this town, this village, is writing about the sort of little houses they have in that village. They really, I think, really appreciate that. It gives them that they learn to trust you better if they know you've been there.
Absolutely. There's a level of authenticity involved in that, and there is value to that. Let's not diminish that for sure. So tell me, as you're out doing this exploration, what are some of the challenges that you're facing as a solo traveler?
I mostly traveled to England and Great Britain. I've been to Scotland too, but and Ireland. But mostly, I am in southern England. This is an extremely safe area, extremely safe country. I've never had any nervousness, and I live in a big city in the U.S. and so there's probably more crimes committed in my neighborhood than there are in England all year for a year. So I don't have security issues the way I might if I were traveling in the U.S. I have traveled alone in the U.S., but and security is always an issue. In England, it just really isn't, even in London. And so I kind of put that aside, and it's replaced by driving on the wrong side of the road, which is incredibly dangerous, far more dangerous. I'm far more likely to go the wrong way on the roundabout and run into a truck, a lorry, than I am to be killed by a serial murderer. And so,
Right.
and I also pose a great danger to everybody else. I feel like putting a big sign on the top of the car, American driver.
Right?
So that's a consideration. I love to drive in England, but it requires a great deal more kind of commitment and concentration than I would use here in the United States. So that's one. But the good thing about driving gets you to places that aren't necessarily on the train route. And there really are places. My favorite place is Wells, which is a cathedral city and a tiny city, but in the Southwest in Somerset. And it's probably 10 or 15 miles from the nearest train station. It's a city. It's a tourist destination because there's a big cathedral there, but they don't have a train, so it's easier to drive.
Got it.
I will take the train to Salisbury, another cathedral city, and pick up a car there and drive to Wells. And so that I think is, I feel like I like the access a car gives me. So that's an issue. Another thing, as I said, I plan everything out. So I have every hotel room, every stop. I find the restaurants I'm interested in going to. And so I have everything kind of planned out ahead of time. So I don't have a lot of worries, really. I think that I like to do things very leisurely, which is another thing. I'm not really good with traveling with other people who like to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and be out by 8:30 and, spend 12 hours seeing all the sights. I like to take things more slowly and spend time seeing things. And so on my own, I can do that.
So while
But
you're traveling like that and you're getting all that information coming in, part of it is you're on a very specific mission. Like
right.
you are there for research, and I'm sure there's inspiration that comes with that, but you're there for the sake of researching. what surprises do you encounter?
I think that I've been there often enough, and I always go back to the same places. So I'm not. I think I have always been surprised at the great love of museum making in England. Wherever you go, there's a museum. As I said, there's a pencil museum. There's a cod museum. Every little town, you could even villages will have a museum. There's Laycock, which is near Wells, and that's where a lot of Harry Potter was filmed. Has a photography museum, and my son out in Los Angeles, he's in the film industry. So I took him to this photography. This guy was one of the inventors of photography, and I wanted to see the grounds and all that, and all he wanted to look at was all these ancient cameras. So they have every kind of museum, and I'm constantly amazed at how the British love to make museums. So that's something that I'm always surprised at the museums they have. so that's something. Wherever I go, I try to look for a museum and see what's there. And often, especially the village museums or town museums, they're little crazy little museums of, and so you can get the British love their eccentrics, and eccentrics are great people, great characters to secondary characters to put in your book. And so it's really fun to come across in a museum, the eccentric old guy who built, St. Paul's Cathedral in Manchester and things like
Fun.
that. And so, because I can put someone like that in my books. So
Absolutely.
the town histories are very good for, kind of giving you these sort of authentically English characters.
How fun is that? I love it. And I'm sure there's a lot to the creation. Now, what I don't know about what you're working on is, are they new stories each time, or are they things that really have the same central characters and build on each other?
Well, when I got started, everybody wrote standalone books, so there was nothing relating to each other. But I started because there's certain things that I'm interested in, which are military uniforms, not necessarily military operations or anything, but the British had beautiful uniforms. And so I got very much into, the 52nd Light Oxfordshire infantry unit wore red coats with gold braid and an orange stripe down their trousers and things like this. And so I've gone to all these different museums to see military uniforms. And so one thing that kind of unites is, because I've done all this research on the Light Division, what became the Light Brigade, all the characters I have are in the military are in this one battalion, brigade. And so it's the 43rd Dragoons of Cavalry, 52nd Infantry. So they're all in these three units in the Army. So I don't have to learn too much more than that.
Okay.
And so that links them in a weird way, because I realized then all these guys would know each other. And so I finally wrote one scene where all of them go to a Waterloo anniversary banquet together. And so that linked all of them. And but this latest set of books that I'm writing are going to be linked. They're mysteries more than romances, and the two characters, the two sleuths, are going to be solving mysteries. I've just got one out and another one finished, and so that's going to be linked together. But they're going to stay pretty much in the south of England. I think London and the south of England. So they will be encountering characters from my earlier books.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, it is. It actually is. This is something I always loved in books, and I don't know why I never thought to do it before. So
you'll be able to kind of bring them back in a different place in their story even.
Right. And this is actually taking place 10 years after Waterloo. So everybody's going to be at a different stage in life. So
very, very cool. That's a lot of fun. One of the things that you mentioned in our pre-interview was that you have found some ways to make travel safer and cheaper. So is that something that you have some tips you're willing to share?
Yes. One of the things that it makes it safer is I tend to go back to the same places each time. I always go back to England. My husband and I go to Italy now every year, but I like to go back to the same places. And so it's safer when you know where you are and you know how to get there and you know it's going to take. In England, everything takes twice as long as they say it will. So if they say this, it's 2 hours from London to Wells, it's actually 4 hours. And so that's just the way it is. I don't know who drives it in 2 hours. I assume someone does, but when you're an American and you're on the wrong side of the road and this is all terrifying, you're not driving 85 miles an hour. So that's the first thing is I know where I'm going because I've been there before.
Sure.
In London, I always stay in the same neighborhood. I stay in Fitzrovia and Bloomsbury. It's the same neighborhood. They're next to each other. And Bloomsbury, of course, is where the Bloomsbury set is. The British Museum is there. And so in London, I know it's where the safe areas are, and because it is a big city. It's a safe city, but it's a big city. And so being familiar with it really does help. And so to make it safer, that's a big thing to make it safer is I know it ahead of time.
Do you stay at the same place for the most part each time?
Oh, I wish I could. But what I do is I rent a flat in London and a cottage anywhere else I go. And so, or I might stay in the same bed and breakfast, but if I can't get the cottage, but so I always get a full flat so that, to be cheaper, you can buy groceries then and not have to go out all the time to eat.
Sure.
So that's also, I find it safer if I have a flat, but you can seldom get the same flat in London.
That would make sense.
And
right.
so I try to stay in the same neighborhood. And sometimes, and I've had like 3 different flats with the same leasing company.
Nice.
So that makes it, that helps with the safety. It's much cheaper to stay, even in London, to stay in a flat than to stay in a hotel. And so you get the whole flat. And so if you got a studio, it's probably a third cost of what a hotel room in a decent hotel would be. Hotels in London are incredibly expensive. They're basically,
Absolutely.
At the level of New York or Tokyo, I think. And so, but once you get on the countryside, these cottages are quite inexpensive. So you save a lot of money getting a cottage if you're going to stay somewhere for more than a few days.
Got it.
So I do that to save money. I also tend to I tend to look how to do things for free. For example, they're not stupid, and they figured out people like to go to the great cathedrals, and so they started charging to get in. However, if you're actually going to go to a service, a church service, they won't charge you. Isn't that nice? But so every cathedral will have evensong, which is a sung service, a choir service every evening. Oh. And you go in, you sit down, you hear, these amazing choirs because they have choir schools. These are all, people who've been trained for 10, 15, 20 years to sing. And then when it's done, you can wander around the church. And so that saved me a lot of money, I think, sure. Because I do that I pretty much do that almost every night when I'm in a cathedral town. Westminster Cathedral in London is probably 18 or 20 pounds to get in. If you go to the evensong, it's free. And
nice.
So another way I save money is to eat locally. I'm not someone who necessarily wants to eat fancy, but the pub food is gotten very good in England. Everybody complains about British food, but it's gotten very, very good since I started going there. And the pub, and so gastropubs are the pubs where they actually have a chef. And so you can get for 10 or 12 pounds a good meal by a good chef and a pint. So that saves money too. I never even bother really to go to a fancy restaurant when I'm in England unless someone's going to take me out. In that case, yeah.
Sounds like a good plan.
Also, in most places with bed and breakfast, they have a full breakfast of, heart attack on a plate, British breakfast. And if you eat that, you don't have to eat lunch. So you can skip lunch and save the lunch.
I love that plan. I'm all about that when I travel.
Yes, that's free breakfasts are great, but I don't think they're good for you. But oh well. So those are some of the ways I save. I go to. There's a lot free in England. Any of the national museums they're all free. The British Museum, the Tate Gallery, all these things are free, and so you can go in there and learn a lot. Other things I do, rather than hire a tour guide, I take the city walks, London walks, which are £6 or £8, and they take you really into the kind of almost the back alleys. And most of the the bigger towns will have a local who will do these little guides, walking things, and they might not charge anything. They just might ask for a tip.
Sure.
And so that's a good way and also to get to know people around you and get to understand the local perspective.
Definitely.
So those are some of the things that I've done to save money. I also, as I said, I'm not a good packer, and so I'm trying very hard to pack light. And I get over there, and of course I never have what I need. They have Oxfam. The British have enormous numbers of charity shops. Wells, for example, has probably 6 charity shops in this town of 10,000.
Wow.
And so if I think, oh my gosh, it's too cold here because it's England, so it's always colder than I expect. And I didn't bring a jacket. You go to a charity shop, and for £3, you buy a fleece or sweatshirt. And
that's easy.
You forgot your umbrella. Well, you can get an umbrella or your sunglasses. And any of these charity shops, everything is very cheap, and they're the sorts of, it's so cheap that when you are leaving, you feel okay at throwing it away because you only spent £1 on this pair of sunglasses.
No, that's awesome.
But I think the biggest thing that I've done to save money is simply I almost never stay in hotels, and these cottages. The cottage I go to in Wells, I try to get to the same one each time, and it's probably £300 for a week, which is less than £50 a night. And the pound now is like $1.20, so it's
sure.
So that's not much more than $1. And I get the whole flat, and it has a refrigerator, and so that's probably the one that saves me the most, because I have to have an automatic transmission. I can drive stick shift, but when you actually have to shift with your left hand,
oh yeah, totally different.
Yeah, it's insane, and the clutch is on everything's on the wrong side, and so I go ahead and upgrade to the automatic, which means it's much more expensive. And of course, gasoline is probably 4 times more expensive there than it is here. So
yes.
A gallon would be $8, $9, something like that. And so even though they have very fuel efficient cars, if you do like I do and you drive, I might drive 1,000 miles in the course of a week.
Sure.
That really adds up.
Absolutely.
Something else I do is I get a National Trust card. The National Trust owns, when really, really rich people and dukes and things like that, and they can't afford to keep their house up anymore, these great big grand things, they give it to the National Trust. And so the National Trust has, 200 or 300 of these great manor houses and castles and things like that. And so you can get a card that allows you into any of them for free. And if you're American, they have a special deal just because, if you're foreign, because you're only going to be there a week or two.
Right.
And so that's even more cheap if you buy it in the United States. And so that is just, once you pay for the card, which might be $50, you can get into any one of these. And there will, in the south of England, because Southern England's always been very prosperous. And so there were a lot of rich people who built a lot of these great houses. And so there are probably 150 of those throughout in the area I look at.
That's awesome.
And they're beautiful. They're extraordinary.
Well, and what a great way to, have as much amusement with that as you want. but really because it's a reasonable investment, not the pressure of we have to go see all this stuff.
Right. And also it's, I never have to think, oh, well, I'm over my budget. I can't go to that one house I'm desperate to go to.
Mm-hmm. No, those are great suggestions. Thank you. Well, I want to make sure that as we, are actually wrapping up our conversation because time has flown so quickly, I want to make sure that people know where to find you, find your books, and just stay connected so they can follow your adventures.
Well, my website is aliciarasley.com. And as I think I told you, I am going to be sponsoring writing retreats. And so if anybody's interested in a writing retreat with a very experienced traveler coach and writing coach, go to my website, aliciarasley.com, and you can email me from there, the contact from there. And I would love to do retreats in England. I do think England's a little expensive for that, but now that I've been to Italy, which is considerably cheaper, I'm thinking maybe an Italian retreat wouldn't be so bad. So
I think they all sound fantastic.
Failing that, we could do it in Indiana. I don't know if anybody's going to make that special trip. But
well, there have been retreats in different places. You never know. It's all about the content, and there's something for everyone.
That's true.
And all of that information will be provided on the show notes, so people will be able to link to you and find you, and certainly connect and check out your books as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me, Jennifer.
Alicia, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing your future adventures.
Okay, and then you can imagine where I went to write this book.
Absolutely. I'd let the imagination run wild.
Okay.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Alicia shared with us today? I especially appreciated her tips for saving money while traveling in Europe, staying at a flat, cooking for yourself, or dining out when somebody's willing to treat you. If you love these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a small financial contribution to the show. There are a lot of options with some great gifts of appreciation at www.patreon.com/Go Solo Live. That's Patreon, Patreon. Please show us some love. Well, sisters, we've reached the end of today's episode, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. Go to www.transformviatravel.com to join our email list or follow us on Facebook at Transform Via Travel. Remember to share our episodes with your friends if they're interested in learning more about what it's like to travel solo. Until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.